In a quiet village where every tick of the clock could be heard across cobblestone streets, an old clockmaker worked alone in his shop, surrounded by the gentle hum of gears and time. For years, he mended hours, repaired minutes, and polished seconds, yet somehow he had forgotten how to live within them. But on one still, moonlit night, as the final hour drew near, he would discover something extraordinary, that time itself can pause, for those who truly listen. The clockmaker lived at the end of a narrow street lined with ivy-covered stone cottages, where time seemed to move a little slower than everywhere else. His name was Elias Thorne, though few called him by name anymore. Most simply referred to him as the old clockmaker, as if his identity had melted into the tick of the clocks that filled his workshop. Every morning, he woke to the soft chime of the grandfather clock beside his bed, the same one he built 50 years ago, and began his ritual. He brewed tea, wound each of his clocks by hand, and listened to their synchronized heartbeat echo through the silence. He had spent his entire life surrounded by the rhythm of time. The walls of his shop were a living symphony of ticking, a delicate orchestra that marked the passing of every second, minute, and hour. It was comforting, predictable, safe. He found peace in the steadiness of it, a peace that many others found unsettling. People came and went through the years, bringing their broken watches and weary expressions. They would thank him for mending what they could not, for making their time whole again. But no one ever stayed long enough to know the man who repaired hours yet rarely lived within them. Elias had never married. He once fell in love long ago, a fleeting, delicate thing, like the brief silence between chimes. Her name was Clara, and she loved wildflowers and storms. She would stand by his window on rainy days, humming softly as the clocks kept time around her. He remembered her laughter more clearly than any face. But one day, the letter arrived. Her family was moving west, far beyond the reach of his quiet village. He promised to visit, to find her again once he saved enough. But the days stretched into months, and the months into years, and soon even her handwriting began to fade in his memory. Now, in his old age, Elias worked slower. The light from his oil lamp trembled across his hands as he adjusted tiny gears and pinions. Dust floated like gold in the air, and outside, the sky deepened into twilight. His workshop smelled faintly of oil and cedar, a comforting scent, like an old memory that refused to vanish. On this particular night, something felt different. The clocks all seemed to be breathing together, their rhythm merging into one steady pulse. Elias sat back in his worn leather chair and listened. It wasn't the ordinary ticking he knew. It was softer, slower, almost like a whisper. He looked toward the far wall where an unfinished clock sat covered by a linen cloth. It had been there for years, waiting for him to complete it. It was meant to be his masterpiece, the final piece that would capture the perfection of time itself. He had designed it to be more than a clock. It was a music box, a celestial calendar, and a compass of stars, all wound into one. But he could never bring himself to finish it. There was always something missing, a silence between the gears that he couldn't fix. Outside, the wind stirred the ivy. The street beyond was empty, the village long asleep. Elias rose from his chair and crossed the room, pulling away the cloth. The unfinished clock gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Its brass frame was etched with delicate symbols, constellations carved by trembling hands. He touched the center where the face should be, feeling the smooth emptiness beneath his fingers. For the first time, he noticed something strange. The other clocks had stopped. Every single one. The pendulums were still, the gears silent. The world had paused. He stood motionless, heart thudding softly in the quiet. He could hear the wind outside, the faint creak of the old wooden floor, even his own slow breathing. But no ticking. Not one sound of time passing. Elias smiled faintly, a weary curve of understanding crossing his face. Perhaps, he thought, this was the last hour he would ever mend. He sat down beside the unfinished clock and began to work. The stillness around him was not heavy or fearful, it was peaceful, like the world holding its breath. His hands moved with surprising steadiness, guided by instinct rather than thought. Each piece clicked softly into place, not with the sharp precision of time, but with the rhythm of something deeper. He wasn't building a clock anymore. He was completing a memory. He remembered Clara again, the way her hair glowed in the lamplight, the way her laughter seemed to slow the room around her. He remembered his mother's gentle voice, the smell of her bread cooling by the window. He remembered the days when the ticking of clocks didn't feel like a boundary but like a song. As he worked, it all returned, not as pain, but as warmth. The final piece, a tiny silver gear, rested in his palm. He placed it inside the heart of the clock and turned the winding key. There was a moment of silence, deep and endless, before the faintest sound began. A single tick. Then another. But this time, it wasn't like before. It wasn't a measure of passing moments. It was alive, soft and steady, like the heartbeat of the world itself. The air shimmered faintly, and through the window, Elias saw something that made him pause. The stars outside were moving. Slowly, gracefully, like they were turning in time with the clock. The moon hung low over the rooftops, bathing the street in pale silver. The ivy on the walls swayed though there was no wind. He felt the air hum with something he hadn't felt in years, life. Elias leaned back, watching the golden hands of the clock align perfectly at 12. The clock's chime rang out, a low, soothing tone that filled the room. But it didn't echo, it flowed, soft as breath, through the walls, across the cobblestones, over the sleeping village. For the first time, he realized that time didn't have to move forward. It could rest. It could listen. He smiled, his eyelids heavy, the warmth of the fire wrapping around him. The clock's glow flickered softly across his face as he whispered to the silence, "So this is how it feels when time stands still." His voice barely reached the air before fading into the quiet hum. When the villagers found him the next morning, he was sitting peacefully at his workbench, hands folded, the clock beside him still ticking softly, but none of the others would start again. The shop felt strangely alive, as if the air itself remembered him. They buried him on the hill overlooking the village, beneath an old tree where the wind always sang through the leaves. And sometimes, on nights when the stars turn slowly and the moon sits low over the rooftops, the villagers swear they can hear a clock chime once, low and warm, as if time itself is pausing for just a breath, remembering the man who once taught it how to listen. The clocks in the shop remain still to this day, except for one, the one Elias finished on his last night. It ticks softly in the darkness, each beat carrying a story, each chime a reminder that time is not the enemy of peace. It is the keeper of it. And if you listen closely, in the quiet hours before dawn, you might hear it too, the heartbeat of stillness, the last hour that never truly ends. The morning after Elias Thorne's passing, the small village felt quieter than usual, as though the air itself was aware that something sacred had ended. The fog rolled low over the cobblestones, curling around doorsteps and fences, muting even the usual morning chatter of sparrows. The bell at the chapel didn't ring that day. The baker, the florist, the schoolmaster, they all stood for a long moment outside the clockmaker's shop, their breath misting in the cold air, unsure whether they should knock or simply listen. Inside, the shop was untouched, preserved in its final moment of stillness. The faint smell of oil and wood lingered, mingling with the scent of cooling ash from the fireplace. Dust motes floated like stars in the pale morning light. Every clock, hundreds of them, stood silent. Except one. The golden clock on the workbench ticked softly, its sound delicate and alive. Its pendulum swayed with perfect rhythm, each movement a heartbeat in the quiet room. No one knew how it worked. There was no visible key, no winding mechanism, no sign of what powered it. Yet, it never stopped. It chimed once every night at midnight, its tone low and warm, almost like a sigh. The villagers began to tell stories. Some said Elias had captured his own heart within the clock, that it beat not with time, but with memory. Others whispered that it was a gift from someone long gone, perhaps from the woman he once loved. A few even claimed that when the clock chimed, they could see faint lights drifting through the village, like fragments of dreams moving through the mist. Years passed, and the world outside changed. The road to the village was paved, the shops replaced with newer buildings, and the younger generations forgot about the old clockmaker. But the shop remained untouched. Ivy grew thick across its walls, creeping through the cracks in the windows. Birds nested in the eaves. The sign that once read Eve Thorn, keeper of time, was weathered smooth by rain. Yet still, the clock ticked on. Then one autumn evening, long after anyone had spoken his name, a traveler arrived. She was a historian, a collector of lost things, someone who searched for what the world had forgotten. Her name was Lillian Hart. She had read a single mention of Elias Thorne in a century-old journal. He mended time as though it were a broken thing. Intrigued, she followed the winding roads until she found herself at the edge of the quiet village by twilight. The locals were kind but cautious. They told her about the shop, about how no one had dared enter for decades. They spoke of the clock that still ticked and the chime that sang each night. Most had grown used to it. The sound had become part of their dreams, something they accepted but never questioned. Lillian smiled softly at their words, thanked them, and set out toward the ivy-covered shop. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The hinges groaned in protest, and a rush of cold air met her face. Inside, time had indeed stood still. Dust coated the counters, cobwebs hung like lace from the shelves, and in the center of it all, the clock sat gleaming faintly beneath the pale moonlight streaming through the window. Its pendulum swayed gently, rhythmic and calm, as though it had been waiting for her. She stood for a long moment, listening. The ticking filled the space around her, soft, almost human in its steadiness. Each sound felt like a whisper, a voice trying to speak through the quiet. She brushed a layer of dust from the workbench and found a small engraving beneath the clock, carved so faintly that it had nearly disappeared with age. It read, "When you stop counting, you begin to hear." The word sent a strange warmth through her chest. She had spent her life chasing records, documenting moments, measuring time in discoveries and deadlines. Yet here, in this forgotten room, she felt something different, a calm she hadn't known she needed. She sat down on the wooden stool by the window, her hands folded, and simply listened. The clock sound was hypnotic, pulling her deeper into stillness. The faintest hum seemed to rise from the air, not from the clock alone, but from everything around it. The shelves, the floorboards, the glass faces of the silent timepieces all seemed to breathe together. For a fleeting second, she could swear she heard more than just ticking. She heard laughter. Soft, distant, like someone remembering joy. Then a voice, low, warm, and gentle. "Do you hear it too?" Lillian turned sharply, but no one was there. The voice was not frightening. It was familiar, soothing, as if it had come from within her own memory. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply. The room seemed to stretch wider around her, like the boundary between moments had blurred. And then she saw it, faint but real. Elias Thorne sat at his bench, his form translucent in the moonlight, his hands moving carefully over the clock. He was younger now, his hair still streaked with silver, his eyes clear and focused. But what caught her breath was the woman standing beside him, smiling softly, her hand resting over his. Clara. The two of them were silent, yet the warmth between them filled the room. He looked up once, as if sensing her presence, and smiled at Lillian. Then the light around him dimmed, and the vision faded, leaving only the ticking clock. Lillian sat frozen, her heartbeat matching the rhythm of the clock. She realized then that Elias hadn't built a device to measure time. He had built a bridge, a way for moments to meet across what had been lost. A piece of eternity captured within a heartbeat. She spent the night in the shop, falling asleep at the workbench as the clock hummed quietly beside her. When she awoke at dawn, the air was warmer, filled with the scent of blooming jasmine from the garden outside. The golden clock had stopped. Its hands rested perfectly at 12. For the first time in more than 100 years, the shop was completely still. She smiled, understanding. It wasn't broken, it had simply finished its work. Elias had been waiting, perhaps not for anyone to fix his clock, but for someone to listen to it. Lillian locked the shop door behind her and left a small note pinned to the frame. It read, "The clockmaker's last hour was never his end. It was his beginning." Then she walked down the cobblestone street as the morning sun spilled across the village. Behind her, the ivy shifted gently, as though the building itself breathed a final sigh of contentment. That night, when the villagers went to sleep, they noticed something missing. The midnight chime never came. And yet, in the silence, their dreams were peaceful, filled with light, warmth, and the sound of laughter that seemed to come from somewhere very far away, or perhaps from within. Years later, when travelers passed through the village, they often stopped before the ivy-covered shop, drawn by a strange calm that seemed to radiate from within. Some said they could feel time slowing as they stood there, their thoughts quieting, their hearts steadying. A few even claimed to hear the faint ticking of a clock that no longer existed. And perhaps, if one listened closely enough, they would understand what Elias Thorne had learned long ago, that time does not truly move forward or back. It listens, it breathes, and it waits for us to stop long enough to feel it. In the end, the clockmaker did not conquer time. He befriended it. He taught it to rest. And in that rest, he found the eternity he had been chasing all his life, not in the endless ticking of seconds, but in the single, perfect silence between them. Lillian remained in Cedar Hollow for weeks after discovering the clockmaker's shop. She rented a small room above the old bakery across the square, where every morning the scent of cinnamon and rising dough drifted through the window. She told herself she was there to research, to write about Elias Thorne and his strange invention, but in truth, she felt tethered to that quiet little shop by something she couldn't name. Each day, she returned to it. Though the clock had stopped, the air still held its rhythm. She would sit for hours, tracing the tools on the workbench, the sketches tacked on the wall, delicate blueprints inked with notes in Elias's careful handwriting. He had written equations that didn't make sense, lines that bent and looped like poetry. To still a moment is to honor its sound. Another note read, "The measure of time is not its passing, but its presence." Sometimes, when the light hit the walls just right, Lillian imagined she could see faint impressions where Elias's hands had rested, tiny smudges on the wood polished by years of quiet labor. It was as if he had built more than clocks. He had built a sanctuary from the noise of the world. One evening, as rain began to fall, she lit a single candle in the shop. The flame flickered, throwing golden reflections across the shelves of glass clock faces. The room seemed alive again, every surface glowing softly. She reached for the golden clock, the one that had stopped, and turned it over gently in her hands. It was warm to the touch. On the underside, she noticed a hidden panel she hadn't seen before. Inside, folded carefully, was a letter sealed with deep red wax. Her breath caught. The seal bore the imprint of a small symbol, an hourglass, encircled by vines. With trembling fingers, she broke it open and unfolded the fragile paper. The ink had faded, but the writing was steady and clear. To the one who listens, it began. If you are reading this, it means the clock has stopped. That is good. It was never meant to go on forever. Time is not a line but a breath, and when it pauses, we are meant to listen. I built this clock for Clara, not to keep her, but to remember her. When she left this world, I feared that silence would take her voice, that I would lose the sound of her laughter. But then I realized that memory is not the enemy of time, it is its echo. And every echo is still alive. This clock is my echo of her, and of all the quiet hours we shared by candlelight. If it has reached you, then you are now part of that echo. Listen carefully. Somewhere in the stillness, there will always be the sound of what was loved. Elias Thorne Lillian read the letter again and again until the words blurred in the candlelight. The shop felt different now, not haunted, but full. The air shimmered faintly, as though something unseen was finally at peace. That night, she dreamed. In her dream, she stood beside the river just outside the village, where the moonlight rippled across the water like liquid glass. There was a bench by the water's edge, and on it sat Elias, wearing his old brown coat, a smile tucked into the corners of his eyes. Beside him was Clara, reading softly from a book of poems. The ticking of a clock drifted faintly through the air, keeping time with the flow of the river. When Elias looked up at her, he didn't speak. He simply nodded once, a gesture of understanding. The river shimmered, the moonlight broke into golden fragments, and Lillian woke with tears on her cheeks. The next morning, she walked to the edge of the river. The mist was thin and silver, the world hushed except for the gentle lapping of water against the stones. She carried the golden clock with her, holding it close. Standing there, she whispered softly, "Thank you," and placed it on a smooth rock at the river's edge. For a moment, it caught the sunlight, glowing like a small sun. Then the water rose, and the clock was carried away, slow, graceful, turning end over end until it disappeared downstream. When she returned to the shop, the air was different. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was light, almost musical. She spent her final evening there writing her story, not of ghosts or magic, but of a man who had taught time to rest, and a woman who had learned that listening is its own kind of eternity. In the weeks that followed, she sent her manuscript to a small publishing house. It was titled The Clockmaker's Last Hour, a quiet story of time and memory. The editor who received it called it hauntingly peaceful. Readers who discovered it said it made them cry softly without knowing why. Many claimed that after finishing it, they found themselves pausing in the middle of their busy days, listening, just for a moment, for something they couldn't quite name. Years later, when the old shop finally crumbled and the ivy grew over what remained, the villagers held a small ceremony. They planted a willow tree beside the ruins, its branches trailing gently over the stones. At its roots, they placed a brass plaque engraved with Elias's words, "When you stop counting, you begin to hear." Now, on quiet nights when the moon rises over the hills and the wind moves through the willow's branches, the village stills for a moment. If you listen closely, between the rustling leaves and the hush of the river, you might hear it, a faint ticking, like a heartbeat in the dark. Some say it's the sound of the old clock, carried by time itself. Others say it's the echo of love refusing to fade. But perhaps it's simpler than that. Perhaps it's just the sound of the world remembering how to be still, a reminder from the clockmaker who once taught even time to listen. Years passed, but the village of Cedar Hollow remained timeless, as if the old clockmaker's spirit lingered in every quiet hour that drifted across its cobblestone streets. Lillian's book had spread further than she'd ever expected. People came from faraway towns to walk the same streets, to see where Elias Thorne had once worked. The shop had fallen into disrepair long ago, its windows clouded with dust, but even the ruin had a sacred stillness about it. No one ever rebuilt it. They said it wasn't meant to be touched again, that it belonged to the air, the earth, and the sound of the river that ran close by. Lillian herself grew older. Her hair turned the color of snow, and her movements slowed, but her voice retained that same calm gentleness. She had become a storyteller, not of fantasy or tragedy, but of quiet truths. Whenever she spoke at gatherings or small libraries, she told people about the value of listening. She would say, "The world rushes to fill every silence, but silence is where the soul learns to breathe." And she would smile softly, as if remembering something she could never quite put into words. One autumn afternoon, decades after her first visit, she returned to Cedar Hollow. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of wood smoke and apples. The leaves along the lane had turned amber and gold, and the river shimmered with that same pale silver light she remembered from her dream all those years ago. She walked slowly, wrapped in a long wool coat, a leather-bound journal tucked beneath her arm. When she reached the willow tree, she stopped. Its branches were vast now, reaching out like gentle arms. Beneath it, the plaque bearing Elias's words still gleamed faintly in the sunlight. When you stop counting, you begin to hear. Lillian knelt beside it, her knees stiff but steady, and placed her hand on the cold metal. "You were right," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "All the moments I tried to hold on to, the laughter, the tears, the people I lost, they never disappeared. They're still here, in the spaces between." She closed her eyes and listened. The wind rustled softly through the leaves, the river murmured its endless rhythm, and for the briefest moment, she thought she heard the ticking again. Not from a clock, but from the world itself, slow, patient, eternal. From her coat pocket, she drew out a small brass locket. Inside was a faded photograph, a much younger Lillian standing before the clockmaker's shop, her eyes bright with wonder. On the opposite side of the locket was a tiny engraving of an hourglass, the same symbol that had sealed Elias's letter. She smiled and pressed it against her chest. "Thank you," she murmured. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, she sat by the riverbank with her journal open on her lap. The water reflected the sky's slow transformation from gold to violet, then into deep indigo. She began to write, not about Elias this time, but about her own journey. She wrote of the way silence could cradle a heart that had been broken, of how listening could become a kind of prayer. She wrote of forgiveness, and of how even time, relentless as it was, could become gentle when met with understanding. As the final light faded, she looked up and saw the first stars appear above the river. They shimmered faintly, like flecks of time suspended in the dark. She felt no sadness, only peace, the kind that comes when every hour has been fully lived. When the night deepened, she closed her journal, placed it beside the willow, and stood one last time to gaze at the village. The bakery still stood, its windows glowing warmly. Somewhere, a dog barked in the distance, and a door closed softly. It was a living place, full of its small rhythms, each one a pulse in the grand clock of existence. As she walked back toward the inn, she heard the faintest echo behind her, not quite sound, not quite silence, just a pulse of something remembered. She didn't turn around. She knew what it was. Lillian passed away that winter, quietly, in her sleep. When the villagers found her journal beneath the willow tree, they placed it in the town's small library. It rested beside her book about Elias Thorne, both bound in soft, time-worn leather. On the inside of the journal's final page, She had written one last line. Time does not take, it teaches. Years later, when snow fell across Cedar Hollow and the river froze into a glimmering ribbon of glass, people would still come to the willow tree. Some brought flowers. Others brought their own clocks, winding them carefully as if to share a moment with the memory that lingered there. And on the stillest nights, when the air hung between winter and spring, the villagers would swear they could hear it, faint, steady, familiar. The sound of a clock ticking softly beneath the roots of the willow, marking not the passage of time, but its presence. They say that's how Elias and Lillian live on, not in hours or days, but in the quiet spaces the world too often forgets to notice. And if you ever find yourself by the river at dusk, when the stars begin to shimmer and the wind carries whispers through the trees, pause for a moment. Don't check your watch. Don't look at your phone. Just listen. You might hear it too, that gentle heartbeat of the world, that reminder that every moment, no matter how fleeting, holds eternity in its stillness. The night deepened, carrying with it a soft, velvety silence that seemed to rest upon the world like a comforting hand. The moon rose high above Cedar Hollow, silver light spilling over the rooftops, the willow, and the quiet rippling of the river. Somewhere far off, a barn owl called once, low and hollow, before disappearing into the dark. In the hush that followed, it felt as though time itself had taken a deep breath and exhaled slowly, settling into stillness. That was when something subtle began to happen by the riverbank. The air shimmered faintly, not with the kind of light one could see, but with a warmth one could feel, the way you might sense a presence standing beside you in a room. It gathered gently around the willow tree, brushing the grass, the stones, the plaque, and the journal that Lillian had left behind. It was not the chill of wind nor the whisper of leaves. It was the hum of something older, something that existed beyond the measure of time. And then, if one had been there to listen closely, truly listen, they might have heard a faint ticking. Slow. Rhythmic. Familiar. The sound of a clock that had not wound in decades. It did not come from any machine, but from the earth itself, as if the river, the soil, and the roots of the willow were all keeping time together. In that sound, the air seemed to shift. A faint golden glow spread beneath the willow's branches, illuminating the plaque, the grass, and the open journal. Two shapes began to form in the light, not solid, not ghostly, but something in between. Elias Thorne, the old clockmaker, stood tall and serene beside the tree, his silver hair faintly luminous beneath the moonlight. Beside him was Lillian, her figure aglow with the same quiet radiance, her eyes bright and calm. They did not speak, for words were no longer needed. Elias turned his gaze toward the village, where faint lights flickered through the windows. He smiled softly, a look of contentment passing over his face. Lillian followed his gaze, her eyes full of quiet wonder. She reached out and touched his arm, a gesture both tender and knowing. For a long moment, they stood there, side by side, watching the night settle over Cedar Hollow. The wind carried the scent of pine and river water, and the stars shimmered as though time itself were breathing through them. Then, together, they turned and began to walk along the riverbank, the glow around them soft and steady, their reflections trailing like candlelight upon the water. As they moved farther away, the ticking sound grew slower, quieter, until it faded entirely, not because it had stopped, but because the listener had fallen into sync with it. The glow dimmed, and the willow's branches swayed gently in the night air, resettling into stillness. The next morning, the villagers found something new beneath the willow. The journal that Lillian had left was closed, and beside it rested a small brass pocket watch, one that no one had ever seen before. Its cover was engraved with a single word, eternal. Inside, the hands of the clock were perfectly still, yet warm to the touch, as though it was keeping time in another world. They placed it inside the library, beside her journal and Elias's letter, where visitors could see it. And in the years that followed, people began to say that if you stood in front of that little glass case and closed your eyes, you could hear it ticking faintly, keeping a time not measured by seconds but by hearts that listened. Children grew up hearing stories about the clockmaker and the writer, and how they'd found the secret to stillness. That time doesn't end. It simply changes shape. Lovers would walk by the river on quiet evenings, pausing by the willow to hold hands and listen for that sound. Artists came to sketch the scene, poets to write about it, and travelers to rest beneath its branches. Each one left with something unspoken, a kind of peace that hummed quietly in their chest long after they had gone. And perhaps, on nights when the stars shone especially bright and the river reflected every glimmer like glass, a few lucky souls would glimpse two figures walking together on the far bank. An old man with silver hair and a woman with a calm, knowing smile. Never rushing, never fading, simply walking, their footsteps in rhythm with the heart of the world. As the years slipped quietly onward, Cedar Hollow changed, as all places must. The buildings aged, the roads widened, electricity came, and the rhythm of life grew faster. But even then, the villagers never let the willow be touched. They said it was the keeper of time, not the kind that ticks on clocks, but the kind that lingers in memory and soul. And when life grew too loud, too hurried, too heavy, people would find themselves drawn there, to the soundless river, the whispering leaves, and the steady calm that seemed to breathe through the air. They would close their eyes, take a deep breath, and listen. And slowly, surely, they would hear it, that quiet pulse beneath everything. Not a sound, not a heartbeat, but something in between, the rhythm of the world that Elias had once heard and Lillian had learned to write about. The rhythm that said, "You are here. You are enough. Time is waiting with you, not against you." And in that stillness, where breath meets silence, where night meets dawn, they would drift, softly, peacefully, into sleep. The night had deepened into that velvet hour when the stars seemed closer, when even the crickets grew quiet, and the world paused between heartbeats. The moon had shifted higher, its reflection trembling across the ripples of the river like threads of soft silver light. The willow tree, ancient and unmoving, rustled faintly as if sighing in its sleep. Its long, graceful branches swayed just enough to catch the breeze, whispering against one another in a rhythm too gentle to disturb, too perfect to be anything but music. The air around Willow Creek seemed to hum faintly, not with sound, but with memory. If one stood there long enough, they might sense it, a presence woven into the night air, into the scent of damp earth and cedar. It was as though the world itself remembered something, the careful hands of a clockmaker, the steady heartbeat of time, the warmth of a fire long extinguished but never forgotten. The soft current of the river carried the reflection of stars downstream, bending them into wavering constellations. A faint mist rose from the water, curling and folding as though the river itself was dreaming. And in that silver fog, a faint glow appeared, delicate, almost shy. It shimmered beneath the willow tree, growing stronger, warmer, until it took the shape of two figures standing side by side. Elias and Lillian. They stood silently, as if listening to something just beyond hearing. Their faces were peaceful, their expressions calm and content. Elias's silver hair glowed faintly, and Lillian's dress, light as moonlight, brushed against the grass without bending it. They turned to look at each other and smiled, the kind of smile that carries across lifetimes, one that says, "We have found it." The moment where everything stops moving and finally rests. The willow branches stirred again, reaching down as though to embrace them. The river's surface rippled once, catching the moonlight in a pattern of dancing silver rings. The two figures turned toward the water and began to walk, each step slow and deliberate. Their reflections shimmered beneath them, blending with the rippling stars until one could not tell where earth ended and the sky began. As they walked, Elias spoke softly, not in words that could be heard, but in a voice that could be felt, like the warmth of a fire or the hush of a lullaby. It was never about stopping time, he seemed to say. It was about learning how to live within it, to feel it breathing with you, not against you. Lillian reached out her hand, her fingers brushing his. And when we listened closely, her voice replied, like the wind passing through chimes, "We find that time doesn't take from us, it waits." Together they paused, standing at the edge of the water. The moonlight wrapped them in a gentle glow, and the reflection of the willow swayed in the current behind them. The air shimmered with that same golden warmth, and for a moment, everything was still. The river, the night, even the stars seemed to lean closer. Then, slowly, they began to fade, their light blending into the mist, until all that remained was the faint echo of a ticking clock, one that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The villagers never knew of that moment, not exactly. But some said that when you stood under the willow tree at just the right hour, the moment between night and dawn, you could feel something like a heartbeat beneath your feet. Slow, steady, patient. And if you closed your eyes, the sound of the river would fall into rhythm with it, as though the world itself was breathing beside you. Years passed gently in Cedar Hollow. Children grew up, lovers aged together, seasons turned and turned again. The old library became a cherished place of quiet, where soft lamplight glowed through the tall windows at night. Travelers would visit, curious about the stories of the clockmaker and the writer, and the legend that had become more lullaby than tale. Some brought offerings, a handwritten letter, a wildflower, a tiny carved clock, and left them beneath the willow, as if to thank it for listening. And on those nights when the rain came softly, tapping against the windows, or when the wind carried the scent of pine and distant snow, people would find themselves thinking of Elias Thorne and Lillian under the willow. They would imagine the way the firelight had once danced across the clockmaker's hands, how each tick of his tools was a heartbeat of its own. They would picture Lillian at her desk, candle flickering as she wrote about things she could feel but not yet name. Sometimes, when sleep came slowly, they would whisper to themselves the story of the man who mended time and the woman who listened to it. They would imagine that quiet shop with its ticking clocks, or the hush of the riverbank at night, or the warm glow spilling from a window where someone was still awake, waiting for dawn. And, as they pictured these things, their breathing would slow. The world around them would soften. In that moment, the ticking sound would return, faint, steady, soothing. It was not the sound of time passing, but of time pausing, waiting, listening. And as they drifted deeper into that stillness, their bodies relaxing, their thoughts unwinding like loose thread, they would feel it, the truth Elias had discovered, that time can, in its own quiet way, stand still for those who truly listen. The wind outside would soften into a sigh, the moonlight dim to a silvery haze. The last conscious thought would fade like smoke, replaced by the deep, restful peace that fills the spaces between seconds. Somewhere, in that perfect silence, the river would keep flowing, the willow would keep whispering, and the stars above Cedar Hollow would continue to blink like patient guardians. The clocks would keep their rhythm, not to rush anyone forward, not to count anything down, but simply to remind the world that even in movement, there is stillness. And as the final thoughts dissolved into dreams, a voice, neither male nor female, neither past nor present, would murmur softly in the space between breaths, "Rest now. You are safe. Time is sleeping beside you." The dream began like a sigh. There was no clear beginning, only the sensation of floating through warmth, through something softer than air. The listener found themselves standing on the familiar cobblestone path that curved along the riverbank in Cedar Hollow. The air smelled of rain and lilacs, the kind that bloom late in the season, when the days grow shorter and the nights feel endless. The sound of the river whispered gently in the background, moving slow and patient beneath a silver mist. The willow tree was there, tall and graceful, its long branches trailing in the water. The leaves shimmered faintly, though no wind stirred them. In the distance, the faint chime of a clock could be heard, not mechanical, but living. Each note seemed to echo through the heart instead of the ears, slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat keeping time with the world itself. The listener took a step forward, the sound of their footsteps softened by the damp earth. The moon was enormous tonight, hanging low over the hills, bathing everything in a cool, glowing silver. Fireflies drifted lazily through the air, blinking like stars caught between worlds. As the listener walked closer to the willow, the world seemed to breathe around them. The grass swayed, the mist curled, the river shimmered brighter. The closer they came, the more they could feel something, a stillness, deep and grounding, as though the entire universe was listening. Beneath the willow's shade, there was an old wooden bench, carved smooth by years of weather and time. Upon it sat a small clock, its brass casing worn but shining faintly in the moonlight. It wasn't ticking. It was completely still. The listener reached out, fingertips brushing the cool metal, and in that instant, the world seemed to shift. The ticking returned, but now it came from everywhere, from the ripples in the river, from the pulse in their wrist, from the stars above. Each beat was soft, even, soothing, not a reminder of passing time, but a lullaby sung by it. A gentle voice drifted through the air, Elias's voice, calm and kind, filled with warmth. "Do you hear it?" he whispered. "Time isn't running away from you. It's waiting here, with you. Every second is a breath, every breath a moment meant only for resting." The listener felt a calmness settle into their body, like the warmth of a blanket pulled close. The night air wrapped around them tenderly. In the faint reflection of the river, they saw not themselves, but scenes flickering like dreams, the clockmaker's shop glowing with candlelight, Lillian writing by the window, the two of them walking hand in hand beneath the stars. Their reflections smiled, and the listener understood. This wasn't a dream about time passing. It was about finding the stillness inside of it. The mist grew thicker, softer, curling like silk around their shoulders. The fireflies drifted closer, their tiny lights flickering in rhythm with the heartbeat of the night. Somewhere in the distance, the bells of the old church tower began to ring, but even those chimes were slow, patient, each tone stretching into the next as though reluctant to disturb the peace. The listener sat on the bench beneath the willow tree. The wooden seat felt cool and familiar, as if it had been waiting for them all along. The ticking slowed again, softer, softer, until it was no longer a sound, but a feeling, like the rhythm of a calm sea beneath their skin. The stars above shimmered, and one by one, they began to drift downward like falling petals, dissolving into the mist. Lillian's voice joined Elias's now, faint, musical, filled with the kind of serenity that only those who have found peace can carry. Every story has an ending, she murmured. But endings are only another way of resting. Close your eyes, and let the hours fade. The world will wait for you. The listener closed their eyes. The last thing they saw was the river glowing like liquid silver, the willow swaying gently, the two figures walking into the mist together, hand in hand, smiling. The night wrapped around them completely, soft and endless. And then, everything became weightless. There was no sound, no movement, just warmth. The ticking had faded into silence. The mind had loosened its grip on thought, sinking deeper into stillness. Breathing became slow, steady. The body felt lighter, as though it were floating on the edge of a dream too gentle to ever end. The willow whispered one last time, its leaves brushing the air like a sigh, "Rest now. You are safe. The world is quiet. Time is asleep beside you." And in that silence, soft and complete, sleep came. The stars above Cedar Hollow glowed a little brighter, as though watching over the dreamer. The river continued its eternal song. The clockmaker's shop, the library, the town, all of it faded into the gentle rhythm of dreams. And time, patient and kind, waited just outside the edge of sleep, smiling. The night deepened over Cedar Hollow, folding the valley in a blanket of velvet quiet. The stars had stretched themselves wide and clear across the sky, glowing with that tender, endless light that seemed to shimmer between wakefulness and sleep. The river's song softened even more, not gone, but slower now, as if it too were falling into a dream. Each ripple that lapped against the stones of the riverbank whispered a gentle rhythm, a pulse that matched the slow beating of a resting heart. Somewhere in the stillness, a candle flickered to life inside the old clockmaker's shop. It was faint at first, a delicate glow trembling behind dusty windows, but soon it grew steadier, warmer, painting the inside walls with the hue of amber and honey. The tools on the bench, the tiny screwdrivers, the coiled springs, the half-finished watches, glimmered faintly as though remembering the hands that once shaped them. And if one listened closely enough, through the hush of the night, one could almost hear it, a breath, a sigh, a whisper that wasn't quite from this world. "Time never truly leaves us," came Elias's voice, soft as drifting snow. "It only changes shape." Outside, beneath the willow, the air shimmered faintly, bending the light of the moon like water around a pebble. The listener, or perhaps the dreamer, still sat upon that wooden bench, their body at ease, their heartbeats slow, their thoughts untangling themselves from the day. They could feel that same warmth, that same tender pull toward something infinite and kind. The sound of the clock's ticking returned, but now it was woven into everything, the breath of the river, the hum of the night, the faint murmur of the leaves. It was no longer about counting seconds, it was about listening to them melt away. Every tick seemed to stretch longer than the one before, fading into silence, replaced by the gentle rhythm of sleep. A cool breeze drifted through the willow's branches, carrying the faint scent of lavender and rain-washed earth. The mist thickened over the water, glowing faintly silver under the moon. Fireflies pulsed gently, their lights moving in slow, sweeping arcs as if painting secret words in the dark. Somewhere, an owl hooted, deep and steady, echoing like a heartbeat through the forest. The listener leaned back against the bench, eyes half closed, feeling the world breathe with them. In, out. In, out. Each breath became a tide, rolling softly in time with the river's flow. The earth felt alive beneath their feet, not busy, not rushing, but patient and still. They thought they saw something, a faint figure standing across the water. Elias, perhaps. The outline was soft, shimmering, his shoulders relaxed, his face turned toward the moonlight. Beside him stood Lillian, her hair silver like the mist, her expression one of peaceful wonder. They weren't ghosts, no, they were memories that had found rest. They turned toward the listener, smiling that knowing, quiet smile that says everything is as it should be. Then they faded, not vanished, just blended into the light, becoming part of the night itself. And then, the listener realized something deeper, that this place, this feeling, had always been within them. That the willow tree, the soft ticking of time, the kindness of the river, they weren't just scenes from a story, but reflections of the calm that lives inside every heart when it finally stops running. The voice of Elias came again, lower now, almost like the murmur of the river. When you let go of the day, time lets go of you too. You don't have to hold it anymore. Just breathe. Just listen. So the listener did. The air grew warmer around them, thick with the scent of moss and wildflowers. The stars seemed to descend closer, as though bending to kiss the quiet world below. The moon rippled on the surface of the water, no longer a distant light, but a companion keeping gentle watch. The night pressed closer, not heavy, but safe. A weightless warmth spread through the listener's chest, down their arms, their hands, their legs, like sunlight spilling through a forest canopy. The ticking of the unseen clock slowed even more, now faint, steady, patient. One. Then another. Then silence. And in that silence, there was peace. Dreams drifted like petals on the surface of still water. The listener could feel themselves falling through them, weightless, surrounded by fragments of starlight and laughter. They saw glimpses of old clocks melting into constellations, of the willow tree growing from the moon's reflection, of the river transforming into threads of time that shimmered like silk. Each image passed gently, never startling, only soothing. And with each passing dream, the body grew lighter, the breath deeper, the mind quieter. Soon there was no boundary between the listener and the dream. They were one and the same, floating endlessly in the soft space where night and sleep meet. The willow's branches swayed in slow rhythm, brushing the surface of the river as though stroking it to sleep. The sound of the water became a lullaby, a soft, repetitive whisper that rose and fell in time with the stars. In the distance, the town of Cedar Hollow slept soundly. Windows glowed faintly with the last embers of fireplaces, cats curled in baskets, and clocks ticked softly in forgotten corners. The entire valley breathed as one, slow, deep, resting. And over it all, the old clockmaker's spirit lingered, not watching, not counting, but simply existing, wrapped in the same silence he had once longed for. He had finally stopped measuring time. Now, he simply was. The willow tree glimmered faintly, its reflection shimmering like silver ink across the river. The last of the fireflies drifted upward, their glow fading into the blanket of stars. The air held its breath, the night stood still. And somewhere, deep in the heart of that stillness, the listener's final waking thought came like a whisper, "I am safe. I am calm. I am home." Then the world vanished into warmth and quiet. Sleep had come, deep, endless, dream-filled sleep, the kind that feels like returning to something ancient and kind. The stars, the river, the willow, and the clockmaker all became part of it, turning together in a rhythm older than time itself. The story did not end, it simply drifted on, somewhere between a sigh and a dream, where everything glowed softly and nothing ever hurried again. The fire in the little cottage at Willow Creek burned low, its glow deepening into soft pools of amber light that flickered along the wooden walls. Outside, the night stretched wide and silent, the kind of quiet that makes the world seem like it's holding its breath. The river nearby murmured gently, flowing past smooth stones that had been shaped by centuries of water's touch. Above it all, the stars hung low and bright, like pinholes in a great velvet curtain, spilling soft silver light onto the sleeping valley. Inside the cabin, time seemed to slow. The soft creak of the rocking chair near the fireplace blended with the steady rhythm of the burning logs, a quiet duet that filled the air with warmth. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, a scent that brought with it an unspoken sense of comfort, like the memory of a story told long ago. Elias, the old clockmaker, sat near the fire, a faint smile softening his face. His eyes, once sharp with the precision of his craft, now gleamed with something gentler, contentment. In his hands, he held a small pocket watch, the last one he had ever made. Its ticking was barely audible, but it pulsed like a heartbeat in the stillness. Each tick seemed to echo in the air a little longer than it should have, stretching time just enough for the moment to linger. He thought of the years that had passed, the endless hours bent over his workbench, the steady hum of clocks filling his little shop, the way people used to visit not only to buy his creations but to hear his stories. He had spent so long measuring other people's minutes that he had nearly forgotten how to live within his own. But the night had taught him differently. The river had shown him how to flow without counting. The wind through the pines had whispered that time was not a ruler, but a rhythm. And the fire, soft and patient, had reminded him that even endings can glow with beauty. The listener, perhaps you, sat across from him now, half dreaming, half awake. The fire's warmth reached your skin, and with it came the deep, soothing weight of rest. The world outside no longer felt distant. It breathed with you, in sync, in peace. Elias looked up, his voice soft and low, like a story being told for the last time. "Do you hear that?" he asked. "That's time slowing down. Not ending, not gone, just resting. It's the sound the world makes when it remembers how to be still." You closed your eyes. The ticking grew quieter until it melted into the sound of the river. The night air brushed your face like silk, cool and kind. Somewhere beyond the window, a lone owl called into the darkness, its sound long and hollow and calm. The moon had risen higher, casting a trail of light across the water, turning it into a moving mirror of stars. The reflection swayed gently, as if time itself were breathing through it. The willow tree by the bank leaned closer to the river, its branches glimmering with dew that shimmered like tiny lanterns in the night. Every sound, every movement, every breath began to flow together, the river, the fire, the ticking watch, the soft hush of wind. They became one long, endless note, wrapping around the world like a lullaby. And as your breathing slowed, matching the steady rhythm of the night, the story deepened. You found yourself walking through the woods near the creek. The air was cool but gentle, each step cushioned by fallen leaves that glowed faintly under the moonlight. Ahead, the sound of water grew louder, not rushing, but whispering, a sound that seemed to hum your name in its current. When you reached the clearing, you saw it, the willow tree, tall and luminous, its roots dipping into the stream. Beneath its branches sat Elias, though younger now, his hands steady, his eyes clear. He was fixing a clock that gleamed like it was made from moonlight. As you drew closer, he looked up and smiled, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped turning. "This is the place where time forgets to move," he said softly. "Not because it's broken, but because it's finally content." You sat beside him, the soft grass cool beneath your palms. The river continued to murmur its endless story, one that stretched far beyond memory. Fireflies drifted around you, their light rising and falling like slow, sleepy breaths. Somewhere in the distance, you could still hear the faint crackle of the fire at the cabin, steady and welcoming. Elias placed the watch into your hand. "When the world feels too fast," he whispered, "remember this sound." You held the watch to your ear, and instead of ticking, it pulsed like a heartbeat. Soft, slow, peaceful. And when you looked up again, the clockmaker was gone. Only the willow remained, swaying gently over the water, its leaves whispering secrets you couldn't quite catch. The river shimmered with reflected stars, and above you, the moon bathed everything in silver calm. A deep stillness settled over the world. You lay back in the grass, feeling it cradle you, the earth beneath cool and reassuring. The wind carried the scent of rain and pine, wrapping you in comfort. The world was quiet but alive, the way it feels right before sleep takes you. The pocket watch in your hand grew warmer, its pulse syncing perfectly with your heartbeat. The more you listened, the slower it became. The more you breathed, the softer the world turned. Until, at last, there was no ticking at all. Only peace. The willow's branches swayed overhead, brushing against each other with a sound like a lullaby. The fire's glow flickered in the distance, reflected in the water like tiny fragments of gold. The river carried them gently downstream, toward someplace unseen, someplace endless. You could feel yourself drifting too, not away, but inward. Into warmth, into stillness, into the kind of sleep that feels like being held. The world blurred at the edges, colors melting into soft shades of silver and amber. The night wrapped around you, not as darkness, but as rest. Somewhere in that vast quiet, Elias's voice returned one last time. "Time doesn't end," he said. "It listens. It waits. It dreams with you." And then, as your body loosened, your breath deepened, and your thoughts faded into slow, rolling waves, the story gently dissolved, like mist lifting from the water at dawn. The fire at Willow Creek burned on, steady and kind, its light flickering through the trees, keeping watch over your dreams. The world outside turned in silence, the stars hummed their eternal rhythm, and everything, absolutely everything, was at peace. The fire's glow had faded to soft embers, the kind that breathed quietly in the dark, tiny suns pulsing with the last warmth of the night. Outside, the world was a lullaby. The river moved slowly beneath the stars, carrying glimmers of moonlight downstream, whispering to the reeds that bent close to listen. A cool wind drifted through the trees and found its way into the cabin, brushing gently against the curtains, carrying with it the smell of pine, smoke, and something older, something like peace. Elias sat back in his chair, eyes half closed, a small smile resting on his face. The pocket watch still lay open in his hand, no longer ticking, but it didn't matter anymore. Time had done all it needed to do. In the quiet, there was a strange and beautiful truth, that life wasn't measured in seconds or hours, but in the moments that made you stop, breathe, and listen. The cabin at Willow Creek stood steady, its walls glowing faintly with the light of the dying fire. Shadows danced across the floorboards like memories, of laughter, of stories told by the hearth, of people who came and went but somehow stayed in the air. It was the kind of night that felt endless, not because of the hours, but because of the stillness that filled them. Outside, the willow tree swayed with the rhythm of the wind, its long branches tracing delicate lines against the silver air. The river hummed softly at its feet, the water and leaves and air all breathing together in perfect calm. Every sound, every small rustle, every gentle sigh, folded itself into the quiet until it felt like the whole world was asleep. You could almost imagine yourself sitting there too, the firelight flickering against your face, your hands wrapped around a cup of warm tea. The weight of the day would slip away, little by little, until you were left only with that soft, steady pulse, the rhythm of your breath, the heartbeat of the earth beneath you. And in that stillness, something deeper stirred, not thought, not memory, but peace. A peace that didn't need to be explained or earned, only felt. It was the kind of peace that comes when everything is exactly as it should be, the stars above, the river flowing, the fire glowing faintly as it fades. The night deepened, and the fire sank into silence, leaving behind only its warmth and a faint trace of smoke curling upward. Elias finally leaned back, the pocket watch resting on the table beside him. His eyes closed, and his breath slowed to match the rhythm of the world outside. He didn't sleep to escape the day. He slept because the night had given him permission to rest. And you, listening, could feel that same permission wash over you. The sound of the river became softer still, like a heartbeat beneath a blanket. The stars above shimmered in rhythm with your breathing. Time didn't matter anymore. It had slipped quietly out the door, leaving you wrapped in the present moment, safe and still. Somewhere in the distance, a single ember cracked, bright and brief, before fading into the ashes. The sound echoed softly, like a whisper, "You are home." And then everything, the fire, the river, the stars, settled into one deep, gentle silence. You felt yourself drift, not falling, not floating, but resting, as if the whole world had become a soft cradle holding you close. The last traces of the firelight faded behind your eyelids, and the air wrapped you in calm. The river murmured one last lullaby, a song of stillness, of warmth, of dreams. Elias's voice seemed to return one final time, carried by the night breeze. "Sleep well," it whispered. "The clocks have stopped. The world is listening." And as your breathing slowed, and your thoughts melted into that quiet, the story closed like the final turning of a page. The fire at Willow Creek burned on, soft, eternal, waiting for morning, and the night held you in its arms until sleep came, deep and endless and kind.